I caught it between the candlelight and the clink of silverware, a look so far away it didn't belong in that room. It was her birthday dinner. She just leaned back in her chair, laughter spilling in the direction of someone telling a story I wasn't a part of. Half a second was all it took. No argument, no distraction, just a quiet vacancy in her eyes, like she'd stepped out of her own body and left the shell behind to nod along. The brass compass I'd given her years ago dangled from the strap of her purse, catching a stray beam from the overhead light. She'd once treated that compass like a charm, a little talisman she kept close. I'd seen her twist it in her fingers before interviews, slip it into her coat pocket before long drives. Tonight it swung idly, ignored, while she tilted her head toward a man across the table, smiling at something I hadn't heard. She didn't notice me watching. Or maybe she did but didn't care. The conversation around us swelled, laughter, the low hum of background music, the clink of ice in glasses. I kept my face still, my fork tracing the edges of my plate without lifting a bite. There was a time she'd squeeze my hand under the table in moments like this, some small reminder we were here together. That was gone. The space between us had grown invisible walls, no cracks, no hinges, just a subtle, persistent separation. When the server refilled her wine, she thanked him without looking up from her phone, her thumb drifting across the screen like it was a lifeline. The glow lit her face for a second, softening the corners of her mouth. I wondered if she was reading a message from someone in this room or someone far away. She laughed again, shorter this time, as though whatever had been said didn't deserve more. The sound didn't reach her eyes. I took a sip of water, letting the coolness settle against the heat building behind my chest. I didn't speak, not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't trust which ones would come out first. Her chair angled slightly away from mine, an unconscious pivot, but one that made the room feel different. The cake arrived, candles flickering. Everyone sang. She smiled for the group photo, leaning toward the woman next to her. In the shot, my arm was there, but my presence was. The night carried on, a rhythm I couldn't quite step into. I caught her fingers brushing the compass once as she reached for her drink, but it was absent-minded, mechanical. Whatever it had meant before, it didn't hold that weight now. By the time the bill came, I'd already memorized that look she'd worn at the start. It wasn't just distance. It was recognition of somewhere else she'd rather be, and maybe someone else who'd notice if she didn't show. I signed my name on the receipt without glancing at the total. We stood, she thanked everyone, her laugh bright again for the crowd. The compass tapped softly against her purse with each step, a sound I'd always liked. Tonight it felt like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name yet. The weeks after her birthday moved like a slow tide pulling back from shore. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "They're proof." It was smaller than that. She started angling her phone away from me when a notification buzzed, just a slight tilt of the wrist that turned a shared object private. She used to leave it face up on the counter, screen lighting up with work threads and dumb memes from our cousins. Now it arrived on the table already flipped, as if the glass itself had learned to blush. New names appeared in her casual stories, people I'd never met but apparently everyone else knew. The studio group, she called them, like a place existed that explained away the frequency. There was a Kai, a Leela who's not Leela because she goes by Lee, a guy named Theo who knows branding. She said it like I should be impressed. I wasn't jealous. I was curious about how quickly a vocabulary can change a life. You swap names and suddenly you swap loyalties. It happens more quietly than betrayal. It looks like expansion. One night I found the brass compass in the dish by the door, nestled between loose change and a safety pin. Its chain had a new kink in it, the kind that comes from catching on something and being pulled free. I rolled it between my fingers and noticed the engraving had collected a film of lotion, a cloudy sheen that dulled the letters. It used to live in her palm during hard days. Now it lived where things get forgotten until the next season. Her screen lit with a new icon I'd never seen. Clean white, sharp lines, a name designed to sound secure. She covered it with her thumb before the banner finished sliding down, then smiled like she'd thought of something funny. The smile didn't reach me. Later, on the balcony, she took a call and spoke in the voice people use when they're certain a neighbor's listening. Low, measured, editions of Mehem that gave nothing away. Through the glass, I watched her trace the rim of a plant pot with her free hand, tiny circles, like calming herself with motion. I told myself to be generous. We're allowed new friends, new groups, new hours. The problem wasn't novelty, it was pattern. Her replies started to arrive with that careful lag that says you read it and chose delay. Invitations from mutual friends turned into, "You go ahead, I'm beat," followed by a late-night photo from somewhere that wasn't the couch. A charred pizza crust, a mural wall, a blurry elbow in a hoodie that didn't look like hers. Always framed to be harmless, always just public enough to shut down questions. The digital part arrived like weather. An email from one of my accounts flagged a sign-in from a city we'd never visited. At first I chalked it up to a VPN, some server leapfrog, but the timing matched her late yoga night. Then came a calendar prompt requesting access to view my events for coordination. It auto-filled her address from an old sharing setup. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. I declined and stared too long at the screen, as if the pixels might admit intent. We passed each other in narrow hallways. She'd brush past with a quick apology that hit my shoulder but not my eyes. On Saturday, she borrowed my car and adjusted the seat and never moved it back. When she returned the keys, the compass was still in the dish. I nudged it so it faced upward again, letters catching the kitchen light. She noticed and smiled, small, as if I'd straightened a picture frame she didn't care about anymore. A Tuesday morning, she asked if I could forward a confirmation for a client dinner when I hadn't mentioned to her. "You left the tab open," she said, pouring coffee, eyes on the stream, not me. I hadn't, or maybe I had and didn't realize how closely she watched. It slipped into work in tiny ways. A client referenced a comment she made about how I hate early calls. I don't. I hate people assuming favors are free. When I asked who mentioned it, he waved it off. "Oh, one of your people." It is strange to feel your privacy thin without a crime to report, like hearing footsteps on the floor above your apartment knowing no one lives there. You start adapting by degree. I changed one password, then another. I shortened my answers. I let question marks go unanswered if they arrived after midnight. One evening, I put the compass in her hand as we headed out the door. "You forgot this," I said, the way you might say umbrella. She weighed it like it meant nothing and slipped it into her coat pocket. An hour later at the restaurant, it was back in the dish, somehow ahead of us, as if it had found its way home by choosing to be lost. I didn't ask how. I just felt the shift. Something I gave to keep us oriented had become something she left behind to travel lighter. By then I had started screenshotting things that might vanish, little timestamps, an unfamiliar icon beside a name, the way her reflection in the window smiled at whatever lived on her screen. Not evidence. Not yet. Just coordinates in case I needed a map. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon when my focus was buried in invoices and client follow-ups. A soft chime from my laptop, a cloud sync notification, slid across the corner of the screen. I almost ignored it. But the thumbnail froze me. It wasn't one of my files. Her cloud account had synced to mine once, months ago, after she'd borrowed my laptop for a presentation. We'd both forgotten about it, or at least I had. Now her newest upload appeared automatically in my folder. I clicked before I could decide not to. It was a photo, slightly overexposed, the kind you get when a phone camera catches too much light through a café window. She was leaning in toward a man whose face was mostly shadowed by a tilted baseball cap. The table between them was small, cluttered with 2 coffee cups, a half-eaten croissant, and the brass compass. My compass. It sat near her elbow, turned so the engraving faced the camera, as though someone had gone out of their way to position it like that. The photo wasn't framed like a selfie. It looked like it had been taken from the next table over, the angle too deliberate to be accidental. She wasn't touching him, but the lean spoke its own language, shoulders angled in, chin tipped down, the kind of posture that keeps a conversation inside a bubble. I sat back in my chair. The easy thing would have been to tell myself it was nothing, that the compass on the table was coincidence, that the lean was just friendly. But the image felt curated, not just captured, staged. Like someone wanted it to be open to interpretation, but not so open it could be dismissed. I closed the window and reopened it 3 times, as if repetition might reveal some hidden detail. Each time, my eyes went back to the compass. She hadn't carried it in weeks, hadn't even glanced at it when I'd offered it to her before. Yet here it was in plain sight, tethered to a moment she hadn't told me about. When she came home that night, I didn't mention it. She dropped her bag on the counter and slipped off her shoes like nothing in the day was worth recounting. She asked about dinner. I said I'd eaten earlier. She didn't press. Later, when she left her phone on the arm of the couch to get more tea, I noticed her home screen had been rearranged. The secure messaging app, the one she'd covered with her thumb, was in the dock now, one swipe away. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. That night in bed, she scrolled beside me, light from her screen flashing across the ceiling. She laughed quietly once, then turned her body away so the phone's glow was blocked from my view. I closed my eyes, counting the beats between her thumb swipes, the rhythm of someone replying quickly to someone they want to keep close. The next day, I opened the photo again. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, studying the sliver of his jaw under the cap's brim. Nothing familiar, but the ease in her posture filled the gap. The compass caught the light in the frame, the same way it used to when it hung from her purse strap during trips we actually took together. I saved the file in a locked folder on an external drive. Not for confrontation, not yet, just to mark the spot on the map. When I shut the drive and slid it into my desk drawer, the room felt heavier, as though I'd just placed something in storage that couldn't be returned. That evening she came home later than usual. Her excuse was soft, unconvincing. Ran into someone from the studio group, we grabbed a quick coffee. She didn't mention a name. I didn't ask. Instead, I watched her set her bag down. The compass wasn't there. She noticed me looking and gave a brief, almost absent smile before heading to the kitchen. From the hallway, I could hear the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic, the small, domestic noise of someone who still believed they were moving through an untouched space. I stayed in my chair, picturing the café, the lean, and the compass face down on that table, turned away from me in every possible way. It was almost too easy. A Tuesday evening, quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher, and her tablet sat open on the counter. She'd been reading an article earlier, then wandered off to fold laundry. The screen dimmed, but the lock never engaged. I didn't go looking for anything specific, at least that's what I told myself. My hand moved before I'd decided. The browser was open to a news site, but a tab behind it caught my eye. A logo I didn't recognize, clean and minimal, the kind of design meant to look harmless. I tapped it. The page reloaded into a chat window, the left column a list of names, the right filled with messages in narrow bubbles. The most recent thread sat near the top. I didn't need to scroll far. It wasn't romantic in the obvious way, no declarations, no emojis meant for screens only. But the timestamps told a different story. Nearly every night after midnight, little bursts of conversation. Jokes built on shared references, callbacks to earlier exchanges, and woven between them the casual undermining I knew too well. "He doesn't even notice when I'm gone," one message read. Sent at 12:43 a.m. 3 nights ago, a reply, "That's because you've got him trained." Her answer came quick, more like he's just wrapped up in his own little world. I let him stay there. It wasn't a dagger, it was the slow turning of one. I kept reading. Mentions of late coffee runs, playlists they were building together, talk about how she needed someone who saw the bigger picture. The tone was light, but the intimacy lived in the timing. You don't message like that with someone who's just another friend from your circle. I scrolled back months. It started sparse, a few polite exchanges about work. Then came the shift, midnight check-ins, direct photo shares, those inside jokes you don't bother explaining to anyone else. The brass compass didn't appear until last week. She sent a picture of it on a table, captioned, "Remember this," he replied. "You always carried that thing, thought you lost it. Maybe just put it away for a while." When I closed the tablet, I realized my shoulders had gone tight, not from the words themselves, I'd suspected enough already, but from the certainty that nothing about this was accidental. She wanted to be seen in these conversations. Maybe not by me, but by someone. That night I watched her come into the living room, hair damp from a shower, wrapped in the same robe she'd had for years. She sat cross-legged at the other end of the couch, scrolling. When her phone lit up, she tilted it away, reflexive now. "You look tired," she said without looking up. "Just a long day." She nodded, thumb still moving. The compass wasn't in sight. I wondered if it was in a drawer or back on that same cafe table with the man in the cap. I didn't confront her. Instead, I filed the chat history away the same way I'd done with the photo, on the locked drive under a folder that didn't name her. Every detail cataloged, every timestamp preserved. Not to wave in her face, but to keep for myself. It's strange, the quiet you feel when you stop hoping a truth will be better than you imagine. The noise falls away. What's left is a kind of stillness that feels less like peace and more like a room after the guests leave. She turned off her phone before bed, setting its screen down on the nightstand. In the dark, I could still see the faint afterimage of the messages I'd read, the way the words curled around each other without me in mind. Somewhere between her first and last reply, the compass had vanished from her life completely, and I was beginning to understand I wasn't far behind it. It showed up in my work before it showed up anywhere else. A client I'd known for years mentioned over lunch that he'd heard from her about my travel schedule. He said it casually, like it was nothing, like maybe she'd been trying to help. But there was no reason for her to know the details he repeated back to me, exact dates, which meetings were in person, which were remote. I hadn't told her. The only way she could have known was through my email, and the only way she could have read those was from a synced device. Her old tablet, the one I'd found the chat history on, still had my credentials stored from when she'd once helped me review proposals. I'd never removed them. It wasn't clumsiness. It was deliberate enough to be invisible. That night I went into my office after she'd gone to bed. I unplugged the external drive with the photo and messages, set it beside my laptop, and started moving everything work-related onto a new, encrypted backup. Not just documents, contacts, archives, calendars. I changed my passwords in slow, methodical order, testing each one before moving on. The glow from the monitor caught the brass compass on the bookshelf, the one I'd left there last week after finding it jammed in the kitchen drawer between expired coupons and a takeout menu. The kink in its chain was still there. I didn't fix it. The next morning, she asked if I could resend her a file from that joint folder we'd set up years ago. I told her it had been archived. She nodded too quickly as if she'd prepared for that answer. Her coffee cup rattled once against the counter when she set it down. By Thursday, I'd shifted my routines. Client calls moved to a private number she didn't know. Project updates went through an account she'd never touched. I started carrying a small external drive in my briefcase, even for local meetings, insurance against eyes that like to wander. One evening, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw her through the front window, leaning against the counter with her phone angled toward her face. The light hit her in such a way that I could see her lips move without sound, her free hand twisting a dish towel. When I came in, she ended the call mid-sentence. The towel was gone by the time I hung up my coat. That weekend, I opened the drawer where I'd seen the compass last. It was still there, half buried under receipts, a dent in the wood where the chain's clasp had pressed into the surface. I turned it over in my palm, reading the engraving, wondering if she even remembered the day I gave it to her. Then I set it back exactly as I'd found it, chain twisted, face down. The intrusion into my work was different from the other shifts. The encrypted app, the cafe, the messages, those were personal, easy to compartmentalize as emotional distance. But this was operational. It meant she wasn't just stepping out of our life together. She was stepping into places she didn't belong. I didn't tell her I knew. Instead, I tightened the circle until the only access points left were the ones I chose to leave open. Not as bait, just as a measure of how far she was willing to go when the easier routes were gone. That night, she asked if I'd be free for dinner the following week. A specific night she knew I had a late client session. When I said I couldn't, she smiled like she'd confirmed something. The smile didn't reach her eyes. I poured myself a drink after she went upstairs. The ice clinked softly, echoing in the empty kitchen. On the counter, my phone buzzed with a message from a client. It was short. Someone asked about our meeting, wasn't sure what to say. I didn't reply. I just glanced toward the drawer where the compass sat, buried and forgotten, and felt the same quiet resolve I'd had when I first locked my files away. If she was willing to step into my work, she was already further from us than she realized. It was her own friend who handed me the missing piece, without meaning to. We ran into each other at a corner coffee shop on a rainy Friday morning. She was at a table by the window, scrolling on her phone, and waved me over with the kind of hesitant smile people use when they're deciding how much they should say. I sat, ordered a coffee, and made small talk. She asked about work, about the weather, about anything except my wife. Then, as if she'd been holding it in, she leaned forward and said, "She's been testing things." I kept my expression still. "Testing?" Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. "Stories in our group chat, different versions of you, seeing which ones get the most sympathy." I didn't ask for examples, but she gave them anyway. Little rewrites of my habits, my decisions, details adjusted just enough to shift the story. The one that got the biggest reaction, she said, was about me obsessing over a trinket, the brass compass. They'd apparently joked about it for days, how I kept bringing it up as if it meant more than it should, as if caring about it was proof I was too sentimental to notice the bigger picture. I stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon tracing a quiet orbit. Her friend's voice softened. "She says it's harmless, that it's just testing reactions, but it doesn't feel that way anymore." It was an odd word, testing. It suggested an outcome she was working toward, some version of me she wanted to sell. The compass wasn't an accident in her stories. It was a prop, a shorthand to make me small. When I left the coffee shop, the rain had eased into a thin mist. I walked past our old bookstore, the place where I'd bought the compass in the first place, tucked in a case of nautical odds and ends. Back then, I'd chosen it because she liked maps, because she said knowing where you were mattered more than knowing where you were going. Now I realized she was using it to map me for someone else. That night at home, she was in the kitchen when I came in, phone on speaker, talking to someone about the thing we discussed. She cut the call when she saw me, slipping the phone into her pocket without breaking stride. "Dinner in 10, she said, brushing past me with a faint scent of citrus and rain. At the table, I asked how her day was. "Fine," she said, slicing into her food. Her gaze slid past me to the window as if the darkness outside had something worth watching. I didn't mention her friend. Didn't mention the stories or the compass or the way her face had looked when she'd been told the sympathy count was in her favor. Instead, I noted the subtle lift in her posture, the same way she'd leaned toward the man in the cafe photo. A learned shape. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fit. The encryption app, the staged photo, the curated chat logs. It wasn't chaos. It was a slow building case, except I was the subject, not the one keeping the file. When we finished eating, she collected the plates and hummed to herself, a tune I didn't recognize. The brass compass wasn't in sight. It hadn't been for weeks, except in the stories she told to an audience I couldn't see. As I loaded the dishwasher, I caught my reflection in the darkened oven door. Calm, still, unreadable. I realized she might think she was the only one documenting this version of us. She was. I didn't give her a scene. There was no midnight argument, no raised voices ricocheting off the walls. Just a quiet Saturday morning when the air felt thin enough to step through. She was in the shower, steam curling out from the barely closed bathroom door. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, a faint vibration buzzing against the wood every few minutes. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to anymore. In the weeks leading up to that morning, I'd already reduced my life to what I could carry. Work files lived on a single encrypted drive. Clothes pared down to the essentials, folded into 2 duffels. The compass, though, that I placed deliberately on the kitchen counter before I left. I set it face up so the engraving caught the light from the east-facing window, the way it had when I'd first handed it to her years ago. It wasn't a gift anymore. It was a marker, a final pin on the map we'd drawn together, left there for her to find when she came down expecting breakfast. No note, no text, no explanation she could twist into another version for her friends. I loaded the car in silence, each thud of a bag in the trunk sealing off another room in my mind. The street was quiet, only the distant hum of someone's lawn mower breaking the stillness. I started the engine, hands steady on the wheel, and didn't look back at the house. There was no plan beyond leaving. I didn't decide where I'd land until I was already on the highway, the morning sun in the rear view. A short-term rental 2 towns over would do, somewhere with neutral walls and no history. By the time she stepped out of the shower, water still running in the pipes, my phone was in airplane mode. By the time she walked into the kitchen and saw the compass glinting under the pale light, I was already another exit away. I didn't imagine her reaction, didn't picture her holding it, or ignoring it, or laughing it off in whatever story she'd tell next. The point wasn't to provoke. The point was to leave the silence intact, something she couldn't rewrite without filling in the blanks herself. At the rental, I placed my bags in the corner and opened the window. The air smelled different, cleaner in a way that wasn't about the place but about the absence. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the stillness, and realized I hadn't clenched my jaw since I left the driveway. Some people think confrontation is the peak of control. For me, it was the refusal to give her the performance she might have been expecting. No final argument to fuel her sympathy tests. No visible anger to make the story easier to tell. Just a compass on a counter, pointing nowhere in particular. From the quiet of the rental, I watched her life thin out in real time. It started with the background noise, the constant stream of tagged photos, the playful comments under her posts, slowing to a trickle. A week after I left, the man from the café vanished from her feed. Not unfollowed, just absent, like he'd been written out of a draft that was going nowhere. Mutual friends stopped looping her in on plans. Events I used to hear about secondhand were suddenly missing from her stories. The ones who'd laughed along in the group chat must have found new entertainment, or maybe they didn't enjoy being part of something without the thrill of a secret. The curated glow she'd been perfecting for months began to dim. I didn't reach out. Not to her, not to anyone who might pass along a message. The silence worked better without interference. She couldn't test reactions if there was no one left to react. Every now and then a text would land on my phone, a short line about a bill, a stray question about whether I had something of hers. I let them sit unread. The read receipts would have been a kind of engagement, and engagement was fuel. One evening I saw a photo of her through a friend of a friend's account. She was at a gathering, standing off to the side with a drink in her hand, smile just shy of convincing. The compass wasn't in sight, but I wondered if she'd kept it or left it exactly where I'd placed it that morning. Either way, it didn't matter. I started to think of the silence as its own object, something I could pick up, turn over, set down again. It didn't require maintenance. It didn't need to be polished or explained. It just existed, filling the space between where she was and where I'd gone. The last I heard, she'd stopped showing up to the studio group. Stopped dropping in on mutual contacts. Whatever version of the story she'd been telling had lost its edge without the constant feedback loop. Things like that have a short shelf life when you can't keep them alive. I never gave her a final word, a last conversation, or the closure people like to package into something tidy. The closest she'd ever get was the compass, face up, letters catching the morning light, pointing to nothing she could follow. Some things rot faster when you stop touching them. And I had no reason to touch this again.